is Diane Powell, and I'm the chair of the Pittsburgh chapter of Black Women for Positive Change. We'd like to welcome you all with being here this evening. This today marks our ninth annual Week of Nonviolence. And for those who aren't familiar with our organization, we're a national volunteer network, and our goals are to change the cultural norms in our country around violence and to improve conditions and empower working class families. We would like to thank all of you for joining our session this evening. As all of us are aware, our country is really on the cusp of radical change, both culturally, economically, spiritually, emotionally. We are witnessing white anxiety and anger in small pockets of our society around the perceived threats of a minority agenda and social justice. And it's compounded by the undertow of race and the legacy of slavery and social justice issues. These wounds and unaddressed trauma have triggered a backlash in our country. Hate speech is on the rise, anti-Semitism is growing, armed militias have taken to the street, and we've all witnessed the devastating impact of mass shootings. Tonight, we will attempt to discuss some of the uncomfortable truths about race and hatred in America and the role of the faith community in promoting anti-racism. We hope not just to talk about the problems, but to recommend strategies that can be implemented in our homes, our places of worship, in our communities, so that we can bring about healing and reconciliation. We've assembled an esteemed panel of speakers and faith leaders this evening. There's Rabbi Myers from the Tree of Life Synagogue here in Pittsburgh. We have Reverend Eric Manning from Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina. We have the Reverend Dr. Barbara Reynolds, who is a noted author and chaplain for Black Women for Positive Change. We also have Reverend Glenna Huber from the Church of the Epiphany in Washington, D.C. And we have Wasi Muhammad. He's the former director of the Islamic Center here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Before we begin our program, we would like to thank Moms Demand Action for the grant that we received from them and Everytown in June of this year. And a portion of the funding went to host the activities for our Week of Nonviolence this year. So thank you, Moms. And with that, I would like to turn the program over to our moderator, Tony Norman. He's from the Post-Gazette. He's an award-winning journalist, and we're very happy that he agreed to join us this evening to moderate. Please welcome Tony Norman.
It's good to be here, folks. This is an honor to be a part of this and to hopefully stimulate very fruitful discussion amongst our participants here. That question, does hate begin at the kitchen table? The role of the faith community in addressing racism and hatred. Believe it or not, for many people, there is a tacit understanding, erroneous, that faith almost has nothing to do with mitigating the anger and violence in society. I mean, you think about what Martin Luther King did in his letter from the Birmingham jail. He had to remind the clergy, the white clergy of the South, that they had a moral responsibility to take the cries and the anguish of the African-American community seriously and not to consider their protests somehow antithetical to their faith calling. So my question is the same question that Martin Luther King had back in 1964 when he was sitting in that jail cell. What is the responsibility of the faith community in fighting racism? And if it does have a responsibility, what are some of the limitations and the constraints that are imposed upon the people of faith? And I want everyone to sort of feel free to jump in there if you feel moved by the Spirit to say something first. But I mean, we have folks who have wrestled mightily with that question because of experiences in their faith communities in recent years, and I guess we'll be talking about that. But if any who feels moved to weigh in on this question first. How about you, Rabbi Meyer?
Sure. Thank you. And thank you, Tony, for your availability and willingness to host and moderate this important conversation. I think all faith communities have a responsibility to teach their faith well to all of their adherents. I would doubt there's any faith that promotes racism, bigotry, and that sort of speech that goes with it. So the question becomes then, how does one move beyond the simple teachings of that to see to it that it reaches from the quarters of the house of worship down into the home proper? We can't police the homes. We can't always be at the kitchen tables to be part of those conversations. But yet, clearly what we are doing by itself is not working. To wit, since the days that Dr. King spoke those words, here we are, nearly 60 years later?
Right.
And, you take a look and wonder, well, what has really changed? How have we bettered who we are as human beings in America? Some might say, well, Rabbi, you're preaching to the choir, because the people who attend worship services throughout the United States are the people who are deeply embedded in the faith, in the belief, and practice that. That's not enough. We got to grow the choirs. Our choirs are too small. Part of my answer. We need bigger choirs.
Right. It's it is something that certainly was not unique to Dr. King's era, and it's been an affliction, and certainly in this country since the beginning. I mean, we've been marked from the beginning with this, as it were, mark of Cain, this violence, this hatred, and this prejudice. Reverend Eric Manning, I wonder what your thoughts are. I mean, because you and Rabbi Meyer have been thrown into this fellowship that grew out of a mutual pain and assault from white supremacists.
Yeah, and Tony, again, thanks. I think realistically, as Rabbi was chatting, it's something that we have to be intentional about. We need to realistically have the courage to speak truth to power and call out the indifferences, so to speak. If you go back to the letter of Birmingham, Dr. Martin Luther King wrote, there was a call to action to white clergy. And I think realistically, in a lot of instances, there is a spirit of we're just going to stay in this particular place. We're not going to push the issue. We're not going to deal with the systemic racism. If you think about, not to go off on a tangent, but if you think about, 4 years ago when we had President Barack Obama in the White House, You think about how several evangelicals were calling, failed to even acknowledge him as being a Christian. They would say that he's not Muslim. They would say all these other things. And here we are 4 years later, going through the amount of untruths, going through amount of lies, going through the amount of moral decay, and no one is calling it out on the evangelical side. They're not addressing it. In fact, at times they quietly support it. And I think realistically, if we are going to make a change in this country, it is going to require all of God's children to say, we will not allow anyone to invoke hatred within our ether. We choose to be moral. We choose to embrace not just the words, but the action that the Declaration of Independence had. We choose to acknowledge the fact that even in our founding documents, we did not want to acknowledge African Americans as being total human beings because of what that would require. So there needs to be a time in which we deal with that truth. And as I said to Dr. Myers earlier this week, we have to deal with that truth and then allow that truth to give us a sense of trust, and then allow that trust to transform us. But if we never deal with the truth and we continue to bury our head in the sand and say that this is, not happening, this is, it's okay, wink, wink, nod, nod, we can call ourselves Christians, we can have a form of godliness, but deny the power of God, we can do all of these things and make it seem like it's okay. Well, that's not okay. And I think realistically, when we have the unction to really leave our country, our world in a better place, because we have had true dialogue at the kitchen table. We share it with our children, and we impart in them and instill in them, what, that person over there is a great person, irregardless of the color of their skin, irregardless of their gender. They are a good person because they are created in the image of God. And we owe it to them and to ourselves to treat them with a mutual level of respect. We may not agree. And I want to make sure that I share those people. We're not going to agree on everything, but we can at least agree to disagree and then find the wonderful aspect, common ground. Yes, Rabbi and I have this beautiful friendship that was birthed out of a hate crime, anti-Semitism, as well as a white supremacist. And what doesn't get discussed a lot of times is the white supremacist who came into Mother Emanuel was grew up in the Lutheran Church. So why didn't it get discussed?
Right.
Why didn't it get dealt with from a pastoral perspective, right? The white pastor has the ability to begin to change the narrative and say, you know what, we have gotten it wrong. We have made mistakes. We're not going to continue to utilize our Christian faith as a check mark. We are going to live the gospel. We're going to live what God has proclaimed and what he has told us that we need to do. We're going to live out the great commandments. We're going to live these things out. And when we do, then it can slowly begin to transform. The other aspect is we cannot necessarily legislate love, right? The government can't come in and just with its powerful pen say, okay, we're going to love everybody, but they can at least give us the parameters and say, this is the way that we should conduct ourselves, right?
Right.
Which is not happening.
Well, Reverend Huber, you're down there at the Church of the Epiphany Episcopal Church in DC. And I wonder if when Martin Luther King wrote his letter from Birmingham jail, he talked about 11 a.m. on Sunday being the most segregated hour of the week. And I wonder if in the time since then, mainstream churches, which the Episcopal Church is a part of, Christian churches, have made any inroads into sort of like broadening, as a word, the congregation of the faithful, so that you have less segregation now than you did then. I'm just curious.
The honest answer, of course, is no. No. I was reading Lenny Duncan's book today. He's a Lutheran. You just mentioned that that young man who came into Mother Emanuel was Lutheran. The Lutheran Church. Lenny Duncan is an African American man, and he says that the Lutheran Church is the whitest church. That might be accurate. The Episcopal Church, I think, is a close second. The Episcopal Church is the Anglican branch in the Americas, and there are a number of historic Black churches. Many of them are challenged financially, challenged with numbers. Some of them are prospering. We don't have a lot of, the Episcopal Church doesn't have a lot of multicultural churches. You've got some white churches and some other churches, right?
Does that inhibit conversation? I mean, is that in itself the fact that there isn't a lot of give and take along racial lines or maybe even ideological lines, or does that in effect make it possible for a young man growing up, let's say, and I don't know how devout a person this guy was who did the horrific shootings at Mother Emanuel, but if he started out as a Lutheran, could there have possibly been some intervention had there been more people of color in that community, or is that putting too much weight on the ability of the mere presence of a Black person to mitigate the hate in the community?
No, I think that in all churches that, and I can speak with more authority on the Episcopal Church, we have, as our numbers have dwindled, right? And I think a lot of mainstream Protestant churches are seeing people leave the congregation. Church has become a consumerist commodity, right? So if I don't like it here, I can go someplace else. If you're not serving my need, I'm going to withhold my money.
Yeah.
And so leaders then are catering to the masses, not necessarily offering the challenges that the gospel demands, right? So to love your neighbor takes some significant effort, right? To recognize, to see the face of God in the person that you like the least takes some significant effort. And I think a lot of folks, a lot of leaders are trying to make sure that people don't leave the pews. And so we've become conflict averse. And to name, I wrote down something earlier as I was reflecting on some of the things that you were going to ask, the seductiveness of whiteness, right? The seductiveness of the concept of whiteness, the misconception that power over another gives me a leg up. And so many leaders in the Episcopal Church are complicit in the power structures that allow for whiteness to continue to feel supreme in our society. The Episcopal Church historically has been the church of the president's. We've got the President's Church right there at St. John's.
Right.
I think historically we feel aristocratic and that we're upper class, and you can't subtract issues of class when we discuss issues of race.
Absolutely. So I'm curious, Wazi Muhammad, in many ways, we don't want this to become so like a, just centered on the lack of self-reflection on the part of like the Christian church. But I wonder if you, as someone who is of the Muslim faith, um, have noticed a similar sort of disconnect between, the ideology of peace, like the words of faith that are all embracing, and just the attitudes of those within the congregation from person to person, if there is this lack of diversity, let's say. Is that a problem? I mean, just to sort of generalize, that there is a homogeneity within Islamic congregations, or do you not see that particular problem?
Yeah, that's a great question. Hi everybody, Assalamu alaikum. First off, I always like to start with the disclaimer that I, unlike all of these great panelists, am not an expert on religion in any way. I'm not an imam, I'm not a religious leader. I'm an executive, or at least I was within Muslim community leadership. So different role. So I'll do my best to try to keep up. So unfortunately, I got some numbers and statistics. Say in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, right? Not the most diverse city in the world.
Right.
At the Islamic Center of Pittsburgh, I've counted over 50 nationalities of people who come there.
No kidding. Wow.
Absolutely, yeah. We don't have, the only, I think, major religious group in the country that does not have a majority ethnic group. We have a plurality, like of the largest, like in terms of race. Our largest number, I think, is it's all within the 20s, like early 20s. So I think might be Black Americans might be our largest group in the country, with South Asians and Arabs, like right behind, and they're all in that range. And then, I've met brothers from Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan and India and Bangladesh and Malaysia, Indonesia, like all these different places at the Islamic Center in Pittsburgh. So we have a different issue. So we don't have the issue of lack of diversity. We actually have an issue of an overwhelming amount of diversity. And that's really, really interesting, especially with a lot of immigrant families, at least, that are Muslim, have come post 1965. Like a lot of us are here because of the civil rights movement and legislation that came afterwards, the ones who had immigrated. Some had come much later. My family was until almost 1990. So it's about like an interesting thing about, I think it's less about the a lack of diversity, more about, say, understanding the history of this country is an important thing that a significant portion, especially the immigrant Muslims, may not necessarily understand, right? Where it's crucial to understand that, to know how to exist, and especially in our current moment, and understanding how politics is defined, and what we should be working towards. And our religion calls us to go towards justice and fight for justice, especially for our neighbors and our brothers and sisters and siblings in the community. But without understanding that history, how can you do that? So I think we have a thing about educating our community about the history, so we fully understand what is justice in this country, is something that's very important. And we focus, and we're also more decentralized, I'd say, than a lot of denominations within the Christian faith, I believe. Like, we don't have a structure, like the Islamic Center of Pittsburgh, for example, is the Islamic Center of Pittsburgh. Like, there is no other thing above it that we answer to or collaborate with. We work with other mosques and centers, but there's not like a formal relationship in that sense, so it's pretty decentralized. Every mosque every masjid has to do their own thing, and to solve the issues that they're dealing with. And so we advocate for a lot of kind of in interpersonal relationships and how people interact with the world. How do you go about, especially in the moment now, to respond to this and do better for yourself? And there's some things in our faith there that allow us to work. So we have things about structural racism from our faith. It started off as a faith that had many cultures within it, and that allowed it to, from the very beginning, address issues of racism. And that's been very fortunate for us to have modern day conversations. And it's also something that is a practice within our tradition. And that's the last thing I'm going to say, is explain like that, is that we talk about that a lot. I always like using this story and I think there's probably different versions and cultures, but this one is like, there was a scholar and somebody asked about, developing better character, that's it's translated best as character, right? So, and how to do that, he took the coffee cup, he gave him coffee, he finished his coffee, he's like, all right, is the cup clean, right? He was like, no, can you drink the rest of it? He did. Is the cup clean now? I was like, no. Well, try to dump the rest out. And he couldn't, right? So then he goes and fills the cup with water. And he's like, is the cup clean now? Is there any coffee still in it? He's like, yeah, I can see it. It was on the sides and now it's in the water. So then he just kept pouring water into the cup, and continues to do that. And he kept going at and waited for a little while and says, is the cup clean now? Well, it's cleaner, the water purifying slowly, but there's still something there. And it's that concept of how we choose to, it's actually very much related to Ibram Kendi's works, I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with his writings and may have read his book. I mean, no one becomes not racist is the thought, despite a lot of Americans claiming that. They can only strive to be anti-racist on a daily basis to continually rededicate themselves to lifelong tasks of overcoming this feature. So we understand that these, things are within us, and we have to consistently keep pouring water into that cup and doing actively things to make sure that we are fighting injustice. And our jihad, which is our internal struggle to better ourselves, that has to be done every day. And so when you talk about racism, it's because all right, what is your personal practice? Don't just complain about the country, and saying that this is going in the wrong direction. How do you consistently pour water into your cup and remove any impurities that might be there and realize that you have to keep going every day? So it's more of an interpersonal kind of dealing with racism, and the structural piece of it as well being, and not as much power within the Muslim community, quote unquote, say politically or anything. We're hoping to change that and be more active. But in the meantime, in any way that we can, how do we help the current movement is the hope,
Yeah.
Talking too much.
That's fascinating. Dr. Barbara Reynolds, you want to jump in there? And in fact, I want to remind folks that you wrote a book called No, I Won't Shut Up. So we hope you'll live up to that.
And I also wrote the biography of Coretta Scott King, My Life, My Love, and My Legacy. I come from the way of the civil rights movement, and also as what I want to talk about where I am and what I see as someone as an elder in a Pentecostal church and moving around Baptist, Methodist, and many other Black church people. What I'm seeing is a disappointment with many Black pastors. What we have now, and I go back to the King movement, and I'm saying since the King movement, we have not had much of a prophetic voice since the King movement among Black clergy. We have a priestly movement of the sacraments and communion and marriage, but the prophetic voice of Samuel and Nathan and Jeremiah and even Jesus speaking truth to power, we don't have it. And not much of it, because I'm sure you can point to Reverend Barber and Jamal Bryant and a few. But we need a voice that can stand up during this time that we are in, the Trump administration, which has become one of the most racist, white supremacist groups in modern history. And I've listened for the voice when the president called our football players SOBs and said our homelands in Africa were called S-holes. And when Representative John Lewis died, the president did not attend his service. And so I think about what this lack of silence is doing. I remember when the president said that Baltimore, Maryland, was not even a place for human beings, it was just a rat-infested place. And of course, I thought about Elijah Cummings and Nancy Pelosi and many others. But what I thought, because this is a terrible message to send out to our children, who have to grow up thinking the president called where we live a rat hole. And I went to a certain church on Sunday where there were many people, women, children, and from Baltimore. And I came in the door full of hope. I said, oh, now, these people in Baltimore have been so offended and so insulted. Now, I'm sure the pastors here will stand up and say, people of Baltimore, we want to just salute you today. Stand up and let us show you some love. But another missed moment. Now, why is this so important? Because the white evangelicals have a major role in what is happening in this country. Trump has that group a part of his base. And if you're watching TVN like I do, you can find that many of the pastors and preachers on TVN, they have the talking points to say, we're heading towards socialism. There's not going to be peace in the suburbs. But we don't have the voice coming from the Black community that can stand forcefully and talk about our issues. We're dying right now because of lack of leadership. I would think that pastors and preachers would be preaching, vote, vote, vote. I'm not in every church, but I am telling you that I am hearing so much discontent about people who are saying, I don't know why my church is not leading me. I feel like a sheep without a shepherd.
Yeah, we hear you. And
that's one point. But I also want to make another point, but maybe you want to respond to what I'm saying about people want a different kind of church. They want a church that speaks for them. I'm not saying they should be a Republican or Democrat church, but at least talk about the issues instead. I call them church mice, just over in a corner somewhere. You know, I would think that we should do better. But on the other hand, I wanted to go back to Reverend Manny's point about the human rights, because I was in the King movement. I was registering votes, and I was taught, I'm going to give you the 6 principles of nonviolence at some point. But what we were taught, that what was going on in Vietnam when a person was getting napalm was just as important as what was going on in our community. And so I think we have to get to the point of this model of Reverend Manny and Rabbi Myers is so crucial, because we can't be a people say, look at how I'm being offended. Look at my humanity if we can't look at their humanity. So we're going to have to do things that will draw people in. For example, right now is a good example. In my community, we have Black churches that are really doing a great job feeding the people. But if somehow we could connect to people in white communities, because they're suffering just like we are, find a way to get food to them. Maybe some of the white churches could follow a wonderful model that's been presented here, because it's not just our humanity. We have to be concerned about humanity of all people, all the isms, racism, but sexism, all of that. So I had to get my point.
No, that's very wise. And in fact, it really is the elephant in the room when it comes to all faith communities. There really does have to be not just more of an ecumenical spirit, but more of a practical, boots on the ground, existential, and really, if you're going to actually treat folks like we're all part of the same family, that means, family gets close to each other and risks hurting each other. People risk that. And that's what's necessary to be a family, to be willing to make oneself vulnerable in the context of of other people. And I think that there's a certain clannishness, a certain clubbiness that you have in a lot of faith communities that we have to get past. You know, so we've touched upon it sort of here and there, but we haven't really talked about how faith communities can spread the message of anti-racism and connect with people who sit, you know, in the pews, whether you're in a synagogue or whether you're in a church or the mosque or, you know, the Zen Buddhist, you know, shrine. And I want to direct this towards to Reverend Huber. You know, how do we put together a practical approach to making folks recognize the humanity of the other, as it were, especially across not just religious grounds, but just in general? I mean, just sort of embracing people because of their humanity, their humanness.
Right. And maybe that, you know, the first thing I thought as you were asking that question is like, how do you teach people to be compassionate?
Yeah.
Right? How do you teach people to love themselves as God loves them? Right.
Mm-hmm.
So if I love myself the way that God loves me, there's no way that I can be hateful to another person, right? Because I know me. I've seen myself in the mirror. There's some things in my head that don't need to come out, but God loves me anyway. And so if I know that God has loved me through my darkest moments, I cannot, in good faith, treat another person less than made in God's image. Now, you know, the reality of how we live that out, of course, we can see it's easier said than done. And I guess it really does start at the kitchen table.
Yeah.
And, you know, earlier this afternoon, the kids, my kid, I have a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old, and they were having a conversation with my mom. And we were just talking about, you know, God, she said to them, God loves everybody. You know, nobody is better than anybody. God loves you, and God loves white people, and God loves just everybody. And so that's where it starts. And if we can, it's hard to, I think it's really hard to unpack that, particularly for people who have not had the experience of being loved
Mm-hmm.
by society. So, you know, it's amazing to me. People say this all the time. It's amazing. Well, I hear it, that Black people are working towards equity and not just blowing it all up, right? Because we love this America more than this America loves us.
Right.
We love the church. Christianity has been used to demonize and keep Black people in place, yet Black people claim Jesus. We claim God and have made Christianity something that works for us. It is redemptive. We understand that God supersedes how America defines Christianity. And we follow that Jesus. We follow that God, and we know that God is redemptive. And I'm going off on a different tangent.
But I think discussion of a redemptive faith is sort of inextricably linked to this question of tools and reaching out beyond the folks in the pews. Before I forget, we have gotten some comments that have come in that I'll go through real quickly. There's one comment here from someone who really wants to challenge the implication of complacency, and this person says, look at the resolutions at the general conventions. Look at how the American church had conflict about the global church on issues of same-sex inclusion, especially with the African bishops, and how the various dioceses in the churches have made the elimination of racism a priority in the movement to becoming the beloved community. And we have the best presiding bishop we have ever had in Michael Curry, who's an amazing leader in the area of elimination of racism and respect for pathways to God. And this was sent in by Elizabeth Barker, who's a lay person, Episcopal Diocese of Southern Ohio. We thank you for that comment, Ms. Barker. Yeah, it's not to say that nothing is being done. The question is whether what's being done is adequate to the moment. But I guess, you know, it's who's to say? Except there are horrific things that are being done now, sometimes in the name of God, but sometimes just simply hatred expressed towards people of a particular faith. I'd like to go to Rabbi Meyer again. And
Mr. Norman, can I respond to that a little bit?
Oh, yes.
A little bit more deeply.
Absolutely.
Just for folks who are not, aware of Episcopal nomenclature, General Convention is a triennial meeting where we pass resolutions, and it's sort of like, this is what the church is going to prioritize over the next 3 years. This is where we're going to put our money and our energy, and building up the beloved community, which is Dr. King's idea. We passed that resolution to do that. And my response to Ms. Barker was to say, yeah, that's good. Yet, the Episcopal Church historically is, a lot of the money came from the slave trade in the Northeast, right? And so when we say Bishop Curry is an excellent leader, what it took for him to get there, right? What it means for him to be in that position, what it means to be a Black man leading a white church, having conversations around a predominantly white church, having conversations around race. He's not free to just talk about it. He's just not free to say this is what it means to be a Black man in America as a Christian, right? He walks a very fine, in my opinion, I'm looking at it from DC, right? He walks a very fine line so as not to offend anyone or to push them too far away, because you don't want people to leave the table. Right. And I think every gospel, God offers challenge and invitation. And how we do that as leaders, how Bishop Curry does that, how we do that at General Convention, because the Episcopal Church is not a monolith. We are not all liberal. We're not all progressive. There are some very conservative. There are places. There are Episcopal churches that I am not invited to. 1, because I'm a woman. 2, because I'm Black. They don't want to see me. They will not recognize and respect my leadership. So while the beloved community is fabulous and the Episcopal Church is moving in a direction to be, in some places, just to begin to talk about racism, on the ground, there are still some very racist folks who are okay with that racism in the Episcopal Church. And they don't feel like that challenges how they understand the gospel.
Yeah, it's a very complex and a very human problem. I mean, it's rooted in just that basic tribalism, and I wonder, Rabbi Meyer, and I would also like to hear Reverend Manning also address this question. What are the paths to healing? The paths to healing in the face of some of the worst acts of inhumanity. Words, are they enough? are tears enough? There is a value in leaders at the top being models for healing. But what else does it take? What are you gentlemen and your congregations doing to knit those wounds that are still so fresh to you, no doubt, and in the midst of your respective communities?
We're coming up on the second commemoration of the massacre of 11 Jews on October 27th. When people ask me about healing, I never use the past tense because I think we will always be healing, but not healed. And there's so much still to learn about a massacre, to understand what are the things that one should do, because alas, there is no guidebook on it. Pastor Manning and I, for example, are helping to write it. There is no place you can turn for that sort of guidance. My interpretation is that as rabbi, everyone is on a journey called life. I'm here as your tour guide to take the teachings of my faith to help you on that journey so that you can look back upon the journey, the end, and go, wow, that was an incredible journey, and thank you. So that means each person has a different way that they're going to need to be able to heal. While I don't claim to be a mental health therapist, nor would I claim to practice as one, every person has a different path to find the way to heal. And I just hope I can do my best to try to identify what those paths might be, because it's not the same path for any one person. I would submit to you that if you could take 100 people from one of our houses of worship that have suffered a massacre and had 100 slots for where they're at, you could probably fit one person in each of those slots. But I can say this. We live in silos in America. We don't know our neighbors. We're afraid of our neighbors. As long as we insist on living in silos that don't have bridges to connect the silos, America is going to continue the way it is. To break down those silos, we need to learn about our neighbors. The better we know something about our neighbors, the more we can take the fear and misunderstanding and mistrust and turn that into respect, appreciation, and love. I live in Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. My house is actually 5 or 6 blocks from Mr. Rogers' house. His widow still lives in Pittsburgh. Even though he was all about neighborhood and so forth, we still have so much work that we need to do to be able to break down the barriers between neighborhoods, to understand our neighbors. Because I think the better we understand our neighbors, I saw someone to mention about that when we talk about commonalities. The commonalities get us into the room.
Yeah.
The hard discussions, the commonalities don't keep us in the room. They just are the door opener. It's those hard discussions about how are we different? How do we bridge these gaps? How can we work together using our commonalities as the strength to unite us? And that's what commonality is about. Because if you can't get in the door, you're never going to get anywhere. There are lots of doors that are open. I think my responsibility is to enter those doors, use those commonalities to enter into the hard conversations about how are we different? How do we bridge those differences, use those as strengths to model that this can be done throughout the country so we can get to know our neighbors.
It's going to be a very ambitious, because basically we're trying to come up with a new paradigm for talking about these terrible human passions. You know, we have to figure out a way to get people to talk in a non-threatening, to have an open heart, sort of thing you're talking about.
Let me can I bring this into, because I want to talk about how do we talk about one issue and then be wounded and not talk about this. I want to say that I knew Dr. Martin Luther King Sr. and I had a chance to sit down and talk to him once. And his wife had been killed sitting at the church piano playing the Lord's Prayer.
The church organ.
By a Black man.
Mm-hmm.
His son had been killed, by, as we know, by a white man. And he taught me two things. First of all, hate is not a race.
Mm-hmm.
So when we talk about hate, you also have to talk about those who are wounded by people in their own neighborhoods killing them. We don't talk about that, but we just talk about white on black or black on white. But if you're going to talk about the wounded, the funerals I have attended have been by Blacks killing Blacks. Hate is not race. The other thing he taught me is the power of forgiveness. That without forgiveness, we cannot move to the next level. And how do we get to forgiveness is what Rabbi was saying. We have to find a way to not be the most segregated hour in the church on Sundays, to invite others in, to be able to welcome into our church people with purple hair and green hair who maybe used foul language. We're going to have to be a different kind of church if we want to really be relevant in the 21st century.
That's that's hitting it right on the head. Not a different kind of worshiping community, regardless of the denomination, obviously. So Reverend Manning, let's talk about forgiveness, and let's talk about love in action. Let's talk about respect for all cultures being taught. What is that gonna diminish the hate? I mean, is that the root of is that the way you root out all evil, as it were? Can an early childhood education curriculum that is centered on rooting out the hatred work, or is there something more, or is there something more that needs to be done?
I think I would want to say, Tony, I think realistically that a lot of times we look for that single answer. And I would present that there are multiple answers that we have to address. So I will start with, and I can only see her first name, so this is not to be disrespectful, Reverend Glenda. Your comment referring to the fear because our livelihood from a clergy perspective sometimes is based upon those who we are preaching to. And we, of course, will not be able to, at times, be able to preach a word that talks about changing your thought process, becoming more like Christ, or becoming more aligned with God's teaching on love and loving thy neighbor as thyself, if we feel they're going to get up and leave. The other aspect of that is we have to be willing to meet people where they are. And this goes back to, I'm bad with names, the author who just spoke a few moments ago.
Dr. Reynolds, yeah.
Yes, the whole aspect of meeting people where they are. It is very well documented, the relationship that Rabbi and I have. And I went to Rabbi not as a Black man, not as a pastor of an AME church, not a pastor of Mother Emanuel. I went because I could relate to where they were. And I wanted to meet them on the human level and say, I appreciate and love you, and you're not alone in this. Mm-hmm. And I think realistically, we have to be willing to jettison and I don't get upset with me, but we have to jettison our certain faith traditions at times to embrace our humanity, and then to respect each other on the very fabric. As I say to others, if I can just meet you in Genesis chapter 1, chapter 2, we're golden. Because if I meet you there, then I'm meeting you on the basis of humanity. That then allows for me to say, you know what, I can then also forgive you for maybe doing certain things to me. You did not have the knowledge. You weren't taught the right way. It's not making excuses, but it's just basically saying, I don't want any type of animosity to get in the way of where we can go. So I am going to forgive you. And Reverend Anthony Thompson, the widow of Myra Thompson, wrote a powerful book on forgiveness. And he talks about the whole aspect of forgiving. And it is something that we still need to understand. But the only way, when I talk with Reverend Thompson about it, is that there is a love, there is an appreciation for meeting people where they are, and then saying, we are not going to allow you, whatever action you have done, to leave us or hold us in a particular place. And I think realistically, when we're sitting at the kitchen table and we have a discussion that goes like this, if you cut me, I bleed. My blood is red. It's no different than anyone else's. If you use words that don't build me up, they hurt. And I remember the words that were leading up to a couple of years ago to the Tree of Life massacre. And I remember the words that were coming out of the highest office in this land. And it was just fueled with so much division, so much divisiveness, and so much hatred. And I saw the power of God even in the midst of sermon preparation, because all week God had been dealing with me on the importance of knowing that your words matter. Your words can either heal a nation and bring people together, or they can continue to divide us. And I think realistically, we need to understand that our words matter, even in our respective faith traditions, and what we do from a connectional church, what we do from a denominational church. At the end of the day, I love everyone who's on the panel, but I know when we get to glory, when we get there, there's not going to be any denominations, y'all. And if
Are you sure?
Listen, I got it on good authority that when we get there, so if we can't get it right now, while we are walking, while we're seeing each other, if we cannot get it right now, when we're gone, it's going to be too late. So the sense of the urgency is now. It's not a coincidental that we are here on this panel. It's not a coincidence that we are having this discussion. We need to do this more. And I know even within the Charleston community, I tried my best to meet my white clergy brothers, my imams, my Jewish brothers and sisters, everyone on where they are, because I understand that we must meet on the basis of humanity and show. The key word is show that we can make a difference, and we're not going to allow our differences to be extenuated, but we're going to focus more on what draws us together. And as Rabbi said, when we come together on our basis of humanity, then I get to know Rabbi. Yeah, he's a great guy. I love him. I appreciate his friendship, and I know we have a wonderful time together. And I don't let our faith tradition